it's definitely my privilege, and certainly Ryan's as well, to be here today. Our day started back in Dublin at 5 a.m. this morning. If you had heard Ryan complaining in the car on the way in, I'll tell you it was something shocking. I thought, well, this day can only get better, but and indeed it did. We met with Mareka earlier on this afternoon. It was, we were really thrilled to be here in this town. In fact, we went for a quick walk around this afternoon and thought, right, let's go straight in towards our presentation and our tasting, which is why we're all here. I do have a presentation, and I do have a habit, like lots of Irish people, I tend to talk for far too long. So I have asked Ryan and Mareka to act as my official timekeepers. So if you do see me looking over there every now and again, it's because they're going to keep me going. I understand there's a little bit of time pressure this evening. I do have a few slides, and hopefully this should be sufficient to give you a healthy introduction to Powerscourt Distillery, where we are located in Ireland, the facilities of the distillery and our visitor centre, the most important aspect of our distillery, which is of course our master distiller, a small introduction then to our Fercullen Irish whiskies, and I'll explain a little bit about why we're called Fercullen, and then finally our tasting, which I know everybody here, well, hopefully is looking forward to. I know I certainly am. It does say 6. I don't believe in death by PowerPoint. I spent a long time working in the IT industry, and even though people said that they didn't do death by PowerPoint, invariably it led to 40 or 50 or 60 slides. So I've got 6 down at the front. It lulls you all into a false sense of security. I have 6 topics. I have many more than 6 slides. Just very briefly, in terms of Ireland and distilleries now, there's a huge excitement in Ireland at the current time. It's been going on for quite a few years now, but genuinely speaking, it's a really good time for Irish whiskey and Irish distilling in general. If you had gone back 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and come to see Ireland and come to find out about its distilleries, you may have gone home feeling slightly disappointed. That position has changed dramatically over the past little while, to the extent at the moment that we now have 26 operating distilleries on the island, and I think a further 24 odd in planning. The great thing about living in Ireland is that planning can go on for years and years and years and years. But I do believe many of these will come on stream over the next little while. Just in terms of Irish whiskey and understanding the landscape of new Irish distilleries, and indeed Irish whiskey, how that's breaking out at the moment, there's probably 3 tiers of distillery currently in Ireland. There's the very large tiers that perhaps have a capacity of 20, 40 and 100 million litres of alcohol a year. There's a huge drop then down to the next kind of tiering or clustering of distilleries. And these distilleries would have a capacity of sort of, well, roughly around 1 million litres, perhaps up to 3 or 4 million litres. And once again, there's another big drop down again, and you get the much smaller artisanal sort of distilleries that may have a capacity of 100,000 litres, or thereabouts. Powerscourt Distillery is located about a half an hour from Dublin, and we see ourselves very much sitting in that middle cluster. I'll go on to our capacity or our various plant aspects in the later slide, but we at the moment have a capacity of about 1 million litres of pure alcohol a year. And depending on which spirit we choose to make, whether we go in certain months with single malt, or whether we go with pot still, whether we double distill, whether we triple distill, that'll sort of alter that number around. But in terms of the landscape, we exist in that middle tier, and the landscape is evolving constantly. As a distillery and as an idea, we kind of met as a group of 3 different groups came together in February 2016. There was a local couple of families who had an idea to put a distillery on the estate in Powerscourt. There was obviously the estate people who owned the estate, and I'll go on to the estate in a little while, and there was my own family. So we had a combination of three groups. One group that had an idea to put a distillery on the estate, one group who actually owned the estate, and some people, myself and my father, who had been very involved and heavily involved in whisky through our association with the Isle of Arran distillery over in Scotland. I did see somebody wearing a kilt earlier on. Is that somebody? Maybe two. One, two. Are you from Scotland or?
No.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I have a kilt too, by the way. It took us a while as three groups, but over the course of about 5 or 6 months, we managed to put to one side all our squabbles and arguments. We re-engineered what had been the original plan, and we restructured how we'd finance the activity going forward. And we also changed, I guess, some of what would have been the early strategy in terms of the distillery that would ultimately be formed. The company was formed in August, and in fact at the end of 2016, one of the more significant developments that's not actually there, but it does come into January. We met with Noel Sweeney, who is our master distiller. Noel is one of Ireland's best recognised and most decorated and certainly most experienced distillers of Irish whisky, still operating, still working. And it was very, very important to us as a group that if we're going to make a distillery that puts together Irish whisky, central to that was our distiller and central to our decisions. And for everything going forward, we wanted to have Noel on board. Noel joined us in January 2017, and construction started about 8-9 months later. Throughout that period, you might say, well, what was Noel doing? I often ask myself that question. No, that's not true. Noel, actually, we had done a number of things in the formation of our distillery. We wanted to be absolutely certain that the design of the distillery was right, and to that extent, we worked very closely with the very well-known Forsyth company out of Roths in Scotland, and we put together what we felt was a great plan. We put one of Ireland's best distillers and we combined them hand in glove with the Forsyth family, who obviously make excellent distilling plant. So throughout that time, a number of tweaks were made to what would have been our original plant planning. We had also acquired and bought an amount of stock, aged whisky stock that Noel had distilled formerly. I can't tell you where that came from, but I can tell you he's only worked in one place, and the rest of you, I'm sure, can quite quickly figure out where that stock, the origins of that stock. The plant arrived in January 2018, and that was, I think, quite honestly, because when we met with the Forsyths, Richard Jr. And myself, there's Richard Sr., it's a 5th generation family business. Both Richard said to us when we had met them earlier on in 2016, and that's why I asked, by the way, if you were from Scotland, they said in their accent from Rothes, right pal, I'll tell you what's going to happen here. We'll have our kit ready, but you won't have your distillery ready to fit it. So we said, no, I can tell you, we will have the distillery ready, and you won't have your kit ready. One of the things when you are building a distillery of this size is the lead time for the equipment is actually very, very long. In our case, it was 18 months, and at that time, because their order book was very full, some places were looking at two years plus. We took on a bet. It was kind of a private bet, and I guess neither side really meant it, that if we had the distillery ready and they didn't have the plant ready, that we get the distillery for free from them in terms of plant. And they said, well, if you have your building ready and if you don't have your building ready and we have our plant ready, then we'll charge you twice. Suffice it to say that we're all still friends. We had our distillery ready in January and the kit arrived in January, and within 6 months. So by the end of June, we had that plant commissioned. And that, I think, is in no small part because of the expertise and experience of the Forsyth family and the grit and determination that we had as a team going from February 2016 to June 2018, the need to make absolute progress. I think we were really, really fortunate again. We had perhaps planned this, we had pulled together experience both in plant and in terms of running and managing a plant, and design in the form of Richard and Noel working together. We launched our products, our Fercullen products, which you'll be tasting this evening, in October 2018 in Galway at the Irish Pubs Global Festival, which if you've not been to, I'd recommend if you are going to go to Ireland at some stage, if you can get to the town, wherever it is, it moves around as a festival. If you can get to the city or the town where the Irish Pubs Global Festival is going on, it's probably well worth spending 2 or 3 days in that city. And our visitor centre opened in May 2019. So that's a timeline from February 2016 to May 2019. We've gone here from idea and set of plans to working distillery, and now working distillery and opening of the visitor centre. I did mention earlier on, and obviously we're called Powerscourt Distillery. We are in a beautiful part of Ireland. We're in North County Wicklow. It's just about a half an hour's drive from Dublin City, and it's a really tremendous location, backdropped by this mountain here called the Sugarloaf, and in days of old that would have been known as O'Coulon. In fact, the entire area has an old Irish name associated with it, which I'll come on to the next slide. But the estate has essentially used to encompass all the land around. It's sort of shrunk over the years, but it combines a grand house that was built in a 13th century castle, 2 championship golf courses. Also on the estate is Ireland's tallest waterfall. There's a very nice and enjoyable 5-star hotel spa complex on the estate also. The family that lives here, which is the Slazenger family, and has been running the estate since 1961, have a very long-term view on everything. They're gardeners. The estate has one of Ireland's, in fact one of the world's, voted the world's 3rd best gardens. And they believe in planting trees and long-termism. So it seemed to be there was many great things that combined together that made it a great location to place a new distillery. It just happens also that beneath the estate, about 50 feet down, because the estate is encapsulated by the Wicklow Hills, and unfortunately the Irish weather normally means that we get an awful lot of rain. We have a natural lake of water, and that's the water that we are now using in our new spirit. It's also the water, obviously, that we're using for the process. There we go. I'm getting there. So Fercullen, why Fercullen? Dating right back to 808, the area around Powerscourt, which is North County Wicklow, was known as Fercullen, and the Irish meaning of that is essentially men of the Wicklow Hills. I mentioned earlier on that the Sugarloaf was known as Coulon. So Wicklow actually has, in the old days, several names. Coola, it was known at one stage, but also Coulon. Fercullen was the anglicised version of this area. The use of the name Fercullen disappeared somewhere around the Norman invasion, around 1300. So from 800 to 1300, that area would have been known as Fercullen or Fercullen. And in fact, as we were building our distillery, we were looking for things that, anchored us to the location, and certainly had an ability to capture something that was old and something that stood, essentially forever. Reviving it, we're very proud of, because it's allowed us now to have Fercullen spirit of the Wicklow Hills. And whereas at the moment in our current whiskies, obviously those whiskies aren't from this distillery, as the future unfolds and as years go forward, our whiskies will all be from this area. So it seemed quite fitting to us that we start as we intend to continue. Fercullen was an area that was rich in local history. Two very well-known Irish clans were there originally, the O'Tooles and the O'Byrnes. And for essentially about 500 years, these were the two clans that ruled the land and spent their time robbing each other's sheep and doing other bits and pieces that meant for good neighbourly relations. As that ended, the Norman invasion around 1300s put an end to that, and always it was seen throughout the time that the lands were very strategic, even though the borders and the area that had been captured may have changed. Because you had the Wicklow Hills behind you and you had Dublin in front of you, it meant you could go on lovely raiding parties, raid Dublin and disappear back up into the hills. So it was always considered by everybody as a strategically very important landscape. So, onto our distillery. I mentioned earlier on we've worked with 4 sites. In terms of the technical aspects, or the kind of the nuts and bolts of what it is that we actually have, we've got 3 30-ton grain silos. We have a 2.5-ton mash. At the moment we have 4 fermenters, 2 26,000 litres and 2 12,500 litres. 3 pot stills, copper pot stills from 4 sites. And as I mentioned earlier on, about 1 million litres of pure alcohol per year. What we're currently distilling, and in terms of our new spirits, we're making new spirit from single malt and also pot still. We have successfully run our first run of pot still in relatively more recent times. And in terms of investment, the activity, the project to date, represents about 24 million euros worth of investment. And that's not just in Ryan's salary, by the way. That's, no, that comprises. Actually, most of it is. No, that comprises obviously the building works that were done, the acquisition of the plant, the commissioning of the plant, the building of our teams, and obviously the acquisition of some of the old stock that we acquired. And will hopefully see us through the next few years as we continue laying down more stock. Obviously, it being Irish whiskey, there's a minimum period of 3 years and 1 day before we release any of today's spirit. I've gone through the estate synergy, so I won't spend too much time on that. I can see Ryan already staring at me. In terms of the distillery, and why here. So there was an old, somewhat derelict mill house dating back to the 1760s. It seemed like a nice place to start, and we've essentially built a visitor centre and a distillery onto the back of this old building. It's growing, folks, and we have a lot of lessons to learn. But the whole whiskey tourism, the whole entertainment, the whole education side of whiskey has been growing steadily and steadily and steadily over the past, really 20 years. The whole experiential economy, it's growing. And in fact, at the moment, most of the new distilleries in Ireland are also planning visitor centres as part and parcel of their planning. I'd spent a number of years, very enjoyable years living in Scotland in the early 90s. And in those days, and that's where I was introduced to whiskey, I'll be honest about that. In those days, I used to ignore my lectures. I found them quite dull and uninteresting. And by comparison, I found hitchhiking around parts of Scotland and going to distilleries far more entertaining and educational. In those days, you could go to places where a visitor centre was essentially just a counter, maybe a small sort of shop. And there was no such thing as tours. They weren't organised. They weren't, they tended not to be too formal anyway. That's all changed. People now certainly want to come, certainly at our size of distillery anyway, spend time getting to know the place, getting to know the people, familiarising themselves and feeling comfortable as they learn about something which is, it's actually quite inherently complex. It's something that you can have at 3 years, and it's something that you can have at 50 years plus. That's always going to be something that's complex. So we wanted to have a facility where people could come, learn, sit, relax, and enjoy. We have a number of tasting rooms. Obviously, we have this dreadful place here called the bar, and the distillery in the background, where you can see our 3 pot stills from 4 sites. Most importantly, obviously, mentioned earlier on, we have this ugly creature here. We have Noel. Very genuinely, I would say it's impossible at this stage. And look, things will change as time goes on, but it's impossible at this stage to talk about Irish whiskey and somehow not involve Noel in the conversation. Noel had been the head distiller, master distiller and blender at Fercullen Distillery, and as such, since 1987, and as such, an awful lot of Irish whiskey that people are drinking today has actually come from the work of Noel and his teams. In terms of the well-known Irish whiskies that I'm sure many of you will have heard of and sampled over the years, Kilbeggan, Greenort, Tyrconnell, Connemara, which is the only commercially available peated Irish whiskey, were all released by Noel formally, and they've each received tremendous accolades and awards over the years. He's an absolute technical expert, founding member of the Irish Whisky Association, certainly responsible for an awful lot of the work that went into the Irish GI file for Irish whiskey, and he's also a member of the Irish Spirits Association. He's a keen interest in Mayo football as well, by the way. He has 3 sons, each of whom are tremendous musicians. Noel enjoys a good party and has certainly put together in our distillery 2 teams. We're currently running 2 mashes, 2 different teams, a morning team and an afternoon team. They've been hand selected by Noel, and we're really, really, really thrilled to have Noel as a central and a key part of the Powerscourt Distillery and of the Fercullen story. I suppose something, and I had mentioned it to Ernie earlier on, I met Ernie earlier on this evening. I got involved in whiskey a long time ago, and it kind of grabbed a hold of me, and I think for most of us that drink whiskey, at some stage you have that moment. I guess it's the equivalent of the night when you meet somebody and you spend the night talking to them. You have that moment with whiskey at some stage, or you don't. I was very, very fortunate. I'd mentioned that my own family was involved in the Isle of Arran distillery. Our first distiller on the Isle of Arran was a guy called Gordon Mitchell. And if ever you've met somebody who had a real glint in their eye and a real passion and a love for what they do, Gordon personified that. Gordon came from Fercullen Distillery, and Gordon was one of the distillers under whom Noel trained initially. So it was lovely. I mean, nobody knows when they wake up in the morning which way the path is going to go, but it is really nice, and I tell him most weeks, and I mean this very genuinely, and I've no shyness about saying it, it's an absolute privilege to work alongside Noel, and all of us in Powerscourt Distillery have a real awareness of that. Then that's true of the production floor, it's also true of the visitor centre, and increasingly as the years go forward and as our expressions come out, we hope that consumers all around the world will actually feel some of this. Ernie actually put it very, very well earlier on. This additional spirit around the spirit that we drink in the glass. It's quite an important aspect of this marvellous drink. In terms of our products which we'll be tasting tonight, our expressions, we have 3. Fercullen Premium Blend, Fercullen 14-year-old single malt, and a 10-year-old single grain. I won't go into them at great length now, we'll go through that as we do our tasting. I think anybody who's in the industry kind of knows at the moment, it's sort of hard, you know, there's so many new brands coming out. It's one thing, there seem to be so many new prizes, new awards and new things. It can be quite a confusing landscape. Suffice it to say, look, we're like many of Noel's previous whiskies, these current whiskies are picking up accolades and awards all over the place at the moment, and I think that's in no part coincidental. Again, just to hammer the point home, we have a true expert in Noel. Our single, what do we have? Our single, I beg your pardon, our premium blend whiskey. You probably can't read that. I'll read it out to you. Carefully selected casks of aged malt and grain whiskies, mellowed by time in a soft Irish climate. Citrus and vanilla emerge from grain, malt, and oak. These are Noel's expressions on our premium blend. Essentially, what is our premium blend? Well, it's a combination of malt and grain whiskies. There's no whiskey in that bottle that's less than 7 years. It's very, very smooth, and each of our whiskies, each of the ones which you'll taste tonight, they come exclusively from bourbon barrels. How am I doing for time? Am I okay? I'm okay. There was a film at the end of this, so I'm conscious of that. Our 10-year-old single grain, again an exceptional 10-year-old single grain Irish whiskey, delivers light, subtle tones that reveal an underlying complexity and smoothness that lends character and company to any occasion. Oh, what a great line. That lends character and company to any occasion. Noel Sweeney. Well, look, folks, what I would say about later on tonight, let's make this an occasion, and there's plenty of characters in this room. I'm dying to meet you all, so we'll go through that later on with a 10-year-old. This is we used maize, or rather, maize was used in the creation of this spirit, and for that reason, when we taste it later on, it's got a huge sweetness and a very expressive nose. That's one of the things about Irish whiskey and about the GI. It's important that the Irish whiskey maintains and keeps the character or the personality, or at least some of the taste and profiles of the grains from which it's made. And certainly you'll see that later on with the 10-year-old single grain. Our 14-year-old single malt, different to the other two. Our 14-year-old single malt is bottled at 46%. The other two are bottled at 40%. Again, ex-bourbon barrels, double distilled Irish whiskey, and a minimum. So the key there in the word minimum of 14 years. Noel describes it as a classic single malt Irish whiskey with long-lasting sweet malt and fruity fresh finish. Fercullen 14 represents a remarkable whiskey with a maturity beyond its years. I won't go into those details tonight, but again, you've got two little hints there: a minimum of 14 years and maturity beyond its years. Folks, that's the lineup of how our distillery came together, where it is, and our current releases of whiskey based on stocks that we bought. It's hopefully a good indication of the key building blocks that we have as we move forward. My own belief, and I guess everybody might answer the question slightly differently. My own belief, ultimately, what you have in your glass and what your whiskies represent, they're a combination of things. But certainly, Noel has, and indeed every distiller, after many, many years, has some certain traits for which they're perhaps known. It becomes that lovely word there, signature. So I think it's inevitable, and certainly something we're very much embracing. That the new spirit, it represents really Noel's work and the way that he wants our plant to run. So obviously, what are the Powerscourt elements and what are the Noel elements? I suppose the Powerscourt really most obviously we draw from a local water source. And we have a warehouse on site, so we have both the start of the process and the finishing parts of the process. But in terms of where the cuts are made, how long the fermentation is, all those things that influence the new spirit most heavily, that would certainly be to Noel's prescription. Yeah.
Will there be a Connemara, a peated whiskey one day? He's famous for that as well.
He is. I mean, let's be fair. He's the only distiller, who's released a commercial version of a peated Irish whiskey. It's something we talk about. Is it something we're doing at the moment? No. There's great interest in Ireland. I mentioned it's a really good time in the industry. There's a lot of excitement and interest around what would be seen as the really authentic version of Irish whiskey, which is pot still. I mentioned that we've already done a run of pot still. That's something that we'll probably be pursuing far more aggressively necessarily than a peated expression. That's not to say we rule it out. I think our neighbours and friends in Scotland do that really, really well. I think we do pot still really, really well. Who knows which way that'll play out? Yeah, it's certainly we're in the very early stages, and we're ruling nothing off the table. And we're actually very fortunate. I mentioned he has 2 teams that he works with, and in those 2 teams we have a combination of skills. We've sort of the skills, what I would call around the hardware, the pumps, the vessels, all that kind of carry on. But we also have tremendous skills in terms of liquids and the creation of liquids. And some of our younger distillers actually are being given every license and opportunity under Noel's guidance to do a little bit of exploration. Have they come to any hard decisions as to what they want to pursue? At the moment, no, but they're at that stage where they're experimenting on a small scale at the moment, and I definitely wouldn't influence what they do apart from say, guys, when you're happy, let's go and let's bring this up to a proper volume stage. Yeah. I like Connemara. I like a lot of Scotch whiskies. I like a lot of pot stills. As far as I'm concerned, as long as we're making whiskey, my days are getting better each day. So yeah.